Hello and welcome to the first part of a series on air traffic control communications for beginner pilots in ArmA, particularly for the 15th new realism unit. So today we're going to talk about proper traffic calls and function of rotary wing aircraft at a non-towered airport. That means that nobody is sitting up in the control tower up there to my left. So this is going to revolve around the basic pattern that most people are familiar with when operating at an airfield. Your runway that you have, this airfield is MCAS Gravia. We have a full airport diagram to depict this a little bit more detailed. Has two runways on it. We do not use runway 4 left, 22 right. That surface is not used for us for flight operations. However, it is used as a taxiway. And we'll talk about how that gets interesting with taxiing in a minute. Our primary flight surface is 4 right, 22 left. So that's the runway we're going to be operating off of. Your upwind leg will form the nexus of your pattern, and that's based around that operational airstrip that you're using. As it says in our airport diagram, our calm runway is 4 right with left traffic. So we're going to do our pattern based on that. And when you look at that, that's going to have that upwind leg just parallel to that runway. It's going to have a crosswind leg at the top of it that then extends out so that you can move around the airport and not conflict with traffic that's coming up that upwind leg or landing on that runway or departing from it. Then a downwind leg that comes back the other way, and then a base leg before you come back onto what would be upwind if you're not landing, but if you are landing or touching, going the runway surface anyway, which could either be a landing, a touch and go, or a low approach. All of those options, that leg is final instead of upwind. Upwind is just continuation if you're just remaining in the pattern and just continuing your way around that circuit, but final indicates that you're actually going to be heading for that runway surface and you actually need to use it rather than anybody else who might be getting ready to depart just doing what they're doing. They're going to need to pay a lot more attention to what you're up to because they're going to hear that you're on final. We're coming around to that. So this is the basic function of how you interact in the pattern, and we'll just go through basic traffic calls that are used with that. Small note before we begin, as you guys will probably note, my flying is not superb. I am definitely not the best ArmA pilot out there. I don't claim to be, and it would probably be best if we all just don't concentrate on that and instead concentrate on the communications, which is the reason that we're here. When I go to do these traffic calls, another thing you'll note is when I transmit on the radio, there's going to be a bit of a visual cue. You'll hear probably the tone of my voice will change, but more importantly, this indication in the bottom right corner of the display is going to indicate that my radio is actually transmitting. You're not going to hear anything because I am not on a server right now. I'm just doing this in single player so that it's not obstructive to anybody else. But you'll see that come up and stay up for the duration of my transmission and then fade out a moment later when it's done. Okay, with that out of the way, let's ignore my nasty flying, and we'll just do the basic calls that are required for non-towered operation in a traffic pattern. Spooling my aircraft, there's nobody I need to tell about that. I can yell it out to anybody who's around to make sure they don't get caught on any props or rotors. It's a good idea to just check and make sure that that's not the case. But I don't need to really tell anybody on the frequency. I don't want to jam up the frequency with that. So I'm not going to. I'm just going to check and make sure, which I've just done, and then start my engine. As that comes up, I'm going to be looking around. I'm going to be watching for traffic in the air, and I'm going to be looking for traffic on whatever Blue Force tracker or any other device I may have. If I have a radar receiver or anything, I'm going to be looking for any indication that there's somebody actually in the airspace. Once my engine looks like it's pretty much good to go, then I am going to make my first traffic call, and that's just going to be where I'm taxiing to and what my intent is. So I might say, so this airfield, by the way, is MCAS Gravia. In place of Gravia Tower, I'm talking to Gravia Traffic, because I'm talking to anybody who might be in the area who is listening and trying to operate around this field. So my transmission is going to be something like, Gravia Traffic, training 412, taxi, runway 4 right, remaining in the pattern, Gravia. That's just going to indicate to anybody who might be up in the air or on the field, yep, there's going to be an aircraft taxiing, and they're going to be staying in the pattern here. They're also going specifically to runway 4 right, because that's the runway in use. Having done that, all I need to do is just bring it up and begin my hover taxi, or air taxi, or sloppy tailor taxi, whatever we want to call it. In a non-towered configuration, you may note, as you look at that taxi chart or another taxi chart, yes, I am transitioning between taxiways here, but I don't need to call that out. That's just sort of superfluous information, and on a traffic frequency, you don't want to clutter stuff up with that. Tower, it's a little bit different. However, this, if you see those lines up ahead of us, those indicate a hold short. This is a runway we're coming up to. It's not in use, but it is still a runway surface. So I'm going to be very careful to make sure that I check both directions and call it before I get on there. It's like Gravia Traffic, training 412, taxiing onto runway 4 left to 4 right, remaining in the pattern Gravia. I've also added a little information in there to reaffirm who the hell I am and what the hell I'm doing. I'm training 412, and I'm headed down to 4 right to remain in the pattern. But I've now hover taxied onto this runway. So I now own this. This surface is mine, and that's sort of a concept that is important with runways versus taxiways. With runways, it's a lot less common that you'll see stuff stacked up on a runway, multiple people taxiing on it when it is not a towered configuration. In big airports like Kennedy Airport, New York, you might see it basically being used as a holding area for the runway or a taxiway to another runway. That's common there, but you have a ground controller that's shepherding that and making sure that goes in a certain way. In a non-towered configuration, people tend to be a lot more cautious about being on runways, so you'll see stuff like this minimally done. However, it's necessary here just to be able to get to the end of the runway. So as I get to the end, Gravia Traffic, training 412 is clear 4 left, we're short 4 right for left traffic remaining in the pattern Gravia. Having done that, I'm checking to make sure there's no other traffic. I'm listening to make sure that nobody else has said, hey, I'm on final, get out of my way. If nothing like that is the case, then this is my runway, I'm good to go. Gravia Traffic, training 412, taking the active 4 right, remaining in the pattern Gravia. And I can just transition directly onto the runway and begin my lift out. Sloppy as it is, with my center line as misadjusted as it is. That's fine. And that's honestly it for traffic calls for quite a while I'm in this pattern. I can simply build up my airspeed, lift out, and do my thing largely while not really talking. The purpose of that is not to clog up the frequency, because there may be a lot of other aircraft using that frequency, not just at your airfield, but at many other airfields. Traffic frequencies tend to cover a fairly large area with multiple fields, so it's very important, number one, that you specify what airfield you're at, and number two, you don't get too hung up on saying a lot and calling a lot. Watch with your eyes, listen with your ears, and talk only when it's important. For instance, I'm not going to call my crosswind leg right now because that's not really important to anybody. It's not going to help anybody know what I'm doing in a big way, but when I've found it's a good time, I'll just turn across my crosswind leg. There are two types of patterns for calls that I'll show you with doing the downwind calls, and I'll show you the civilian first because that's the most common one and what most people get taught initially. There's also a military pattern which has slightly different calling to it because it's designed for a much higher speed use, typically with fast attack jets and things like that. But for now, we'll just do the regular civilian calls. So I'm going to come back down here on my downwind leg, and join that nice and gently. And I'm going to look at the airfield to just kind of see where I am. I'm going to be careful coming across this midfield area where I'm parallel the airfield on my left, because this is a common place for people to join the pattern. We'll talk about join and exit in a little bit, but for now, I'm just going to be careful about that, because there may be people coming in above me who are trying to cross over from the left, from my left, that side of the field, and come over here to join the pattern. I don't want any of them dropping in on top of me, so I'm going to be very wary of that. If I want to, for safety, depending on what's going on, at this point, I could call Gravia traffic, training 412, midfield downwind left traffic, runway 4 right to land, Gravia. I've given a lot of information in there. I've said where I am in the pattern, that I am at midfield downwind. I'm making left traffic for runway 4 right. That helps people know where they're looking for me as they see me continue to make this pattern. And I am intending to land. Some of that may be gratuitous per call, but I'm just including it all to be safe right now, just not knowing what else might be going in the airspace, for instance. As I come down here, I'm going to look for a good spot where I want to cut across my base leg, and yeah, why not? It seems like it's as good a time as anyway. I'm a helicopter, so I really don't have to worry about having a long time to slow down and descend. So I'm going to start my base turn, and I am going to call this. Gravia traffic, training 412 is turning base runway 4 right to land, Gravia. I'm going to cut across here and line myself up. Where there's a longer pattern, I might also call final. I can give you that call as well, but I'm going to call one or the other typically. I'm not going to call both. So I would have either done this base call I just did, or I'll call another one. You know what? I'm not even going to call it, because that just sounds really weird to me to be doing that right now. So I'm just going to keep going as I am. Nobody else has called out that they're inbound for Gravia, so I'm going to take this. And you know what? I don't really feel like landing. Something doesn't feel right to me. So as we get there, we're going to make it a go-around. But I've done all I need to do. As I've called base, they know I'm coming in. That's a tight base. That's a helicopter base. That's something that you would do with rotary. With fixed-wing aircraft, your pattern is longer. If your pattern is longer for any reason, it's not one of those really tight little slappy ones like that, call your final. Always do that, because it's going to be the safest thing to do. When in doubt, call your final. Tower will sometimes tell you to call your base, but calling final is a good practice to maintain. I'm not even going to go for a landing right now. We're going to go around a second time, and I'm going to give you that call the second way. Gravia traffic, training 412 is going around for right, left traffic. So I'm going to climb out. I don't really want to be right next to the runway. But you see I'm parallel to the runway. I'm not right over it, because there may be somebody departing on that runway or something else going on. If I can avoid interfering with that surface, then I'm going to. But I'm going to check and make sure, yeah, everything looks okay for my crosswind coming up. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did. You know what? I'm just going to truncate this a little bit so that we can get back down there without too much hassle. I'm going to make this kind of a D pattern. Cut it in a little closer so I can get back to my downwind a little quicker. And this time, again, you know, I've made kind of a quick pattern. There's nobody else in the airspace that I can see or I've heard of. I'm good where I am, as far as communications go. Could call midfield. This time, just for the sake of expediency, you know what I'm doing there. We're going to pass it by. So I'm still looking around. I'm making sure nobody's dropping in on my head or anything like that, because that's going to be an important thing, especially around that midfield area. So were this to extend out a little bit more to the southwest, you might see a longer base. A fixed-wing aircraft is certainly going to see a longer base, and you're going to see a more defined base in that final. So I might call Gravia traffic, training 412 is turning base runway 4 right to land Gravia. And then I go into my base turn. And then as a fixed wing aircraft, I might even be a kilometer or two further out before I get around to that. For that reason, and for a safer pattern, I am going to ensure that I call my final leg as I come in, because I don't know who may have had a radio issue or had their headset off, or may not just be knowing what's going on right around that runway threshold area as I come into it. So as I turn back in, Gravia traffic, training 412 is turning final runway 4 right to land Gravia. And I have specified that I am going to land, because I intend to do that. I could say touch and go, I could say low approach, or I could say for the option. For the option indicates, I don't know what I'm going to do. I could do one of those three things, but it's up to me. I have that airspace directly above that runway, and I have the surface itself. I might use it as I see fit. So with that, we'll bring it in. And we'll act, you know, with a fixed wing aircraft, we'd actually be putting it on the touchdown zone. But for now, we're just going to bring it along to the end in hopefully something like a sloppy Taylor version of a controlled hover stop. I'll let that airspeed bleed off, bleed off, bleed off. I haven't had to call anything else because I own the surface. As soon as I called final and nobody challenged me on it, it's mine. So I don't need to say anything. That said, we're down around the end now. I'm going to level it up a little bit. We're going to come off the runway. I'm going to make sure that my tail is clear when I call anything, and then we'll get a double call here, because again, we have two runway surfaces here that I'm working with. Gravity traffic, training 412 is clear 4 right, entering 4 left for taxi back to the ramp. And so I've cleared myself from that runway, letting anybody else who might be using it know, ooh, that's sloppy, that they can make use of it as necessary. And I've now entered into another movement surface, excuse me, another runway surface actually, to make my taxi back to the runway. We're at a taxiway. I wouldn't really need to say that. I could just say taxiing to the ramp. That would be sufficient. And that's, in fact, exactly what I'm going to do here when I clear off of this runway. Make sure that I'm clear of the marks, that my airframe's actually clear of the runway. Gravity traffic, training 412 is clear 4 left, taxiing to the ramp. That's all I needed to say. That's it. Nothing else. No special business. No, I'm spooling down. No, I'm taking this taxi route or anything like that. That's all I've needed to say. Because we're in a non-towered environment, I don't really need to request anything. And typically, there's a known way of doing things at towered fields. I'm actually going to come off the ramp and go somewhere near that helipad over there, so that, or come off the taxiway at least, and I'll drop myself over here, so that you can see, I don't really need to say a damn thing after this point. I'm home free. Okay? So that's it. Basic traffic calls in the towered environment. In a minute, we'll talk about exiting and entering airspace in a non-towered environment. I'll be back with you in a moment. Thank you. Welcome back. It's time to go over leaving and entering airspace in a non-towered environment. So we're back in our aircraft at close to the threshold of runway 4 right. If you look at our taxi chart, we're actually down here on Charlie past the dispersion pads, and we're going to be using 4 right to depart and enter from a number of different ways. The first and easiest way is if I'm going in the general direction that the runway is facing, I can do a straight out departure. And we'll do exactly that in just a second. We'll then talk about rejoin and how to do that. So in this case, I'm ready to lift off. from my parking position, join a taxiway, and get to the runway. I'm going to make my traffic calls as we just talked about. Gravity traffic training 412 is pulled up at Charlie, taxi to 4 right, for straight out departure Gravia. Okay, I've established there doesn't seem to be anybody else around. I'm going to start lifting myself up and bringing myself towards that taxiway. And that runway. Again, in the sloppy Taylor way that I am liable to do. Something is really weird with my track IR. I'm not sure what's going on here. There we go. Alright. That done. I'm going to start moving towards it. We have 2 surfaces here, like I said before. I'm going to call both. Gravity traffic, training 412 is crossing 4 left or 4 right for straight out departure Gravia. I see nobody else around. I'm going to cross 4 left and make my way over to 4 right. That said, I also don't see anybody else on my actual runway that I'm going to use, so I'm going to take it. Gravity traffic, training 412 is short 4 right for straight out departure Gravia. I'm going to check and make sure nobody is taking that frequency. Nobody is talking to me saying they want this runway. I don't see anybody with that. Gravity traffic, training 412, taking the active 4 right, straight out departure Gravia. And I can transition onto the runway in my jerky, horrible Taylor flying way and make my way right along the runway. That said, I'm looking pretty good. I can look around, make sure there's nobody on that upwind leg above me. Nothing else looks funny. I can lift out, basically just head my way, which again is the same direction as the runway. If it's kind of within that 45-degree arc of whatever the runway heading is, straight out departure is a perfectly good term to use. That's exactly what I've done. So I'm going to sort of adjust that a little bit, but it's roughly straight out. There's not a big concern that I'm going to run into any other traffic that's not expecting me over there. So I think I'm okay with my straight out departure. As I come out of the airspace, that's about it. Gravity traffic, training 412, leaving the airspace to the northeast. And I can switch frequency to wherever I'm going. Alright, so I'm going to come back around and we're going to rejoin the pattern. And we're going to do this at that specific point that I talked about earlier, midfield downwind. That is always the best place to be when you're coming back into the pattern, and that's where I'm going to aim to be. Just between Gravia and that hilltop is where I should see it. I should be looking at the control tower as I come in. Ooh, hello, track IR. Can I have my head back, please? Thanks. Alright, so we're going to bring it back around. I'm going to be looking out there towards the airfield to see what's going on as my track IR goes completely nuts again. I'll just pause that because I have no idea what it's doing. And we're just going to drag the aircraft back around towards the field until we're pretty satisfied. Yeah, we're kind of coming inbound onto the airspace. I would be a little further away actually in real life, but it is what it is. So I'm going to call back inbound. Gravity traffic, training 412 is 3 kilometers to the north. Joining midfield downwind left traffic, runway 4 right to land Gravia. I've given a lot of information in that. That's a lot more than most people will give in traffic calls, but in some cases I think it's necessary to have people understand what's going on. If I just say inbound from the north, they're probably going to guess that I'm doing this, but this tells them for sure. Look, hey, I found where I want to be in my downwind. I'm at midfield. Gravia traffic, training 412, midfield downwind, left traffic, runway 4 right, Gravia. I may have said 4 left a minute ago. I was a bit stupid if I said that. That would be incorrect. We're going to stick with it as it is. I keep trying to turn my head to see where the field is. But I know where my landmarks are. So I'm going to use those to continue to navigate this. And that's essentially the re-entry procedure. I would then follow around my traffic pattern and continue to do things here. This time we're actually going to depart in a different direction. We're going to follow this pattern, and as we do the pattern, we are going to depart the pattern after we pass over the runway. Gravia traffic, training 412 is left base for runway 4 right, low approach Gravia. I've now specified my intention. I don't actually want to land. I'm going to do a low approach. So I'm going to bring it around here. I'm going to do kind of a looping thing here because that helps my brain and my track IRs off. Because I think it's the sun streaming in the window over here. But we'll come up back around here and join our final leg. And I'm going to do exactly what I said I'd do. Gravia traffic, training 412 is final runway 4 right, low approach, Gravia. And this is going to necessitate us lifting out or going around in some way or in some other way, having completed that low approach. I come in on my low approach, everything looks good, and we can just keep on cruising. Hello, airfield. Soon to be goodbye, airfield. This time, we're going to depart to the west. Actually, you know what? No. Better teaching point. We're going to go to the east. So, our low approach is completed. We're going to lift back out. I'm checking to make sure there's nobody above me in that upwind leg. That's good. And we're going to come out of it, and we're going to announce our intentions to depart. Gravia traffic, training 412 is departing the airspace to the east. We would announce the same intention if we were in if we were getting lined up for the runway, whatever we were doing there, we would announce it the same way. We'd say, taking the active 4 right departure to the east in exactly the same way. So I'm going to come out here, I'm going to depart the airspace around Gravia, and once I'm reasonably clear of other traffic that's going to be around the airspace of that field, I'm going to call again. Gravia traffic, training 412 is exiting the airspace to the east. Exiting's not really a good term, departing's a better one, but I'm a New Yorker, our phraseology is less than perfect. It's a well-known fact. This time we're going to do a overhead midfield join. This is a useful tool if you're coming from the other end of the airfield. Basically, the best ways you can join a pattern are either midfield, overhead midfield like this coming from the other direction, or straight in. And we'll do straight in a second, just for practice's sake to make sure that we know what we're doing here. So if I've completed my flight over here, yeah, everything looks good. I want to come back to the field. I'm going to turn inbound and get back on the frequency for traffic. Gravia traffic, training 412 is 3 kilometers to the southeast, joining midfield, overhead, left traffic, runway 4 right, Gravia. Mangled some of that phraseology a little bit, but normally getting the bits out is more important than getting them absolutely perfect. So I'm going to stay kind of high. I want to make sure that I'm not bumping into anybody who's in that pattern down below me, and we're going to come out overhead the field, and we're going to do, I think the 15th preferred method is a teardrop join, and we're going to see if we can execute that without me spectacularly failing. That'll be its own entertainment if I do, but the communications is the key factor here. So we come directly overhead the field. I'm checking around, I'm seeing what's going on. There's no aircraft directly below me. There's no aircraft that are going to impinge on my airspace. And I'm also heavily watching this area around midfield on the downwind side of the pattern that I'm coming up to, because that's where I'm going to be in a second. I want to make sure there's nothing around here that's going to interfere with my ability to join into this traffic pattern. I could do a direct join to my left, but a good way to just get a good visual sweep of everything is to do a teardrop entry like this. So we'll fly over that part of the pattern, we'll get out a little bit, and then having glassed that area, we're going to glass it again as we come back in. So I'm going to come back around, and I'm going to announce myself again. as I rejoin into that pattern. But this gives me a chance to see, all right, let's see how my track IR is doing. Nope, it's screwed. That's fine. This is going to give me a chance to see what's going on. I'm going to call again. Gravity traffic, training 412 is midfield downwind runway 4 right, Gravia for low approach. And I've seen everything that's happening in the crosswind, most of that upwind leg, and in the downwind that I'm joining right now, and I can just join it without much ado. I'm going to truncate this a little bit so that after our low approach we can depart in another direction and do this. So we're going to depart to the south this time, which is going to be very different. This airfield is kind of west-east, kind of north-south. It's mostly north-south in my brain. So we're going to go, and I think in most people, so we're going to go with north-south. It's 040 and 220 runways, so it makes most sense that way. So we're going to go for a low approach now. Gravity traffic, training 412 is short base to final, runway 4 right for low approach Gravia. And that indicates we're just going to whip this thing around directly into that final with a minimum of space and time to spare on it. And I'm just going to come directly in. At that point, I've probably made my last traffic call I need to do. If I had concern, if there was a lot of other stuff, I could call final again, but I don't want to clutter the frequency, because that's often one of the things that kills or causes near imminent incidents, as the FAA likes to call them. I'm going to do my low approach. This one's a little higher, and we're going to depart to the south this time, which is not going to be like departing to the east. We're not going to do that directly because we have to basically contest with where the runway's center line is, and I don't want to do that to the right. That's going to be a bad idea. So call it southwest. It's really where we want to go, but we're going to call it south. Anything that's southwest, kind of off the runway heading in the opposite direction towards the numbers end, you want to make sure you call it well. Gravity traffic, training 412 is off runway 4 right, remaining in the pattern for departure to the south, Gravia. So we're going to stay in the pattern here, and we're basically going to be doing the same legs that we were doing, though I can probably start to climb out of it if I want. I'm going to be very, very careful around that midfield area doing that, though, because there's going to be people potentially doing that overhead join there or something where I'm not going to be able to predict their movements as easily as I want to. So around here, again, if my equipment was working, I'd be looking around a lot more, but as it is, we're stuck with it. So this is departure in the opposite direction of the runway, or somewhere in that direction. If we were going to the west or the southwest, this is exactly what we do. To the northwest, we just exit on that crosswind, and we just call that we were departing to the west. If we're departing to the south like this, we're coming off the runway, then we're going to call it in exactly the same way that we would any other direction. You just call it departure to the south. So I'd say taking the active 4 right, departure to the south. That doesn't mean, there's a big misconception that if you're saying departure to the south, you're actually departing the south end of the runway from the north end of the runway. That's entirely wrong. It indicates the direction that you're leaving the airspace, not the direction of your use of the runway. The number of the runway is the only thing that determines which direction of the runway you're using. If I say 4 right, I'm using 4 right. If I'm using 22 left, I'm using 22 left. That's a 220 heading. I'm always using 4 right here. However, I'm leaving the airspace now, so I'm going to call that again. Gravity traffic, training 412 is clearing the airspace to the south. And I've now absolved myself of all of that. This gives us an opportunity to do our final method of rejoining into the field, and really the simplest one. Can be the hardest one to deconflict if you're going fast, but I'm not going fast. I'm in a helicopter, and there's not much else going on around here, so I can get away with this with no problem. And in most fields, honestly, this is just an easy thing to do anyway. If you're just trying to get your ass on the ground, there's no better way to do it. We're going to bring it back around. I think this is going to put us roughly on the right headings, or roughly in the right position straight off the bat if I come back to about a 040. And I'm coming back into the airspace now. I was out of the airspace. I'm just going to call it as it is. Gravity traffic, training 412 is 3 kilometers to the southwest, making straight in, runway 4 right, Gravia to land. making straight in. That's all that needs to be said there. Once I get closer, see, I'm scanning around, I'm looking at the airspace. When I am assured that I'm going to start my descent onto the runway and that there's not going to be anything else conflicting with my pattern, because I'm basically coming into the pattern at that point, at the point that phase joins final, I'm going to call it exactly as I would any other time. Gravia traffic training 412 is final, runway 4 right to land, Gravia. I'll just drop myself in, as I always would, and complete my landing. As I come off this, we're just going to imagine, for the sake of argument, that the other runway is not a runway. It's not truly a movement surface, and we'll just finish it up with the easy peasy taxiing traffic call once we're clear of the runway. So, imagining that what I'm looking at over here is just a jumble of taxiways, I can clear this in the super easy way. As I make sure that my tail is clear of the runway, I'm not going to call it before that just in case my landing gear breaks or something and I end up stranded on the runway. I don't want to confuse anybody. Gravity traffic training 412 is clear right taxiing to parking. And that is all that I have needed to say. So with that, I can bring my aircraft down wherever I'm parking it. And let her rest. Okay? So that is essentially the basic calls for traffic in a non-towered environment. I hope you've enjoyed. We'll come back and talk about towered environments next time around.